Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 331. In this episode, we'll be continuing our journey through the Fall of Númenor as we explore the section titled The Natural Life of Númenor. In this section, we'll learn about the beasts, birds, plants, and other natural phenomena of Númenor, according to Tolkien. Before we get started, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. Hands up, stick 'em up. 3, 2, 1. Whoopshed. Very nice. Good stuff. Felt it coming at me straight to the heart. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., and Eru27. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in March of 2023, Jacob S., Peter B., Paul D., Stephen S., Jay-Z, Bethany E., Daniel D., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien. Thank you all so much for sticking with us over the last year. Hey, I wanted to let you all know about some recent podcasts I have joined as a guest for a couple of episodes. So the first one is The Mythic Mind, where I joined creator Andrew Snyder for a discussion of On Fairy Stories and Tolkien's Tales from the Perilous Realm. For those of you who don't know, these are the stories that are not necessarily Middle-earth stories, but they are non-Middle-earth stories from Tolkien, but they do tell us a lot about Tolkien and what he thought about a whole lot of things. So they're very worthwhile. They're stories we don't always spend as much time with, but they're very worth spending time with. But the main crux of our conversation was on fairy stories. And as you know, I've talked about it a lot on this podcast. On Fairy Stories it's like the Tolkien's literary manifesto. So if you have a good understanding of On Fairy Stories, you kind of understand what he was up to with Middle Earth, why he spent his whole life crafting this legendarium that we all know, love, and cherish. The other podcast I was a part of was Window on the West, and this is a pretty new podcast from the guys at theonering.com. Now, theonering.com has actually been around for a really long time. It actually goes back to like the early days of the internet, right? I think even back to pre-2000, I think is when it started. Those guys took a little bit of a break for some time, but they are back, and they're back strong, and they've started a podcast, Window on the West. And I was recently honored to be a guest on their podcast. And we talked about, just kind of the latest news as far as screen adaptations out of the world of Tolkien, talked a lot about the Rings of Power. And, that's just stuff that everybody who is into Tolkien enjoys talking about. So I highly recommend that you go over and listen to our conversation. Those guys are super entertaining, a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun in that conversation. So check that one out too. It's Window on the West. So with Mythic Mind, you can find it tolkienroad.com/mythicmind, and that'll take you straight to the episode. And then tolkienroad.com/window will take you straight to my episode with Window on the West. And while you're over at those different podcasts, check out what other episodes they've got going on, because they're both doing really good work. So, also, hey, I mentioned the Fellowship of the Road earlier. If you want to become a patron, if you want to support our work here on the Tolkien Road, by the way, I do promise that Greta will be joining us again soon. It's been a little bit of a busy time for her. She's working on some professional stuff, doing some training in her spare time, and that's kind of kept her away from having enough time really to focus on doing the podcast. But she will be back, I promise you. Hopefully it's very soon, maybe in the next couple of weeks. Next up is to do our second part of our Smith of Wooten Major discussion. She's definitely going to be back here soon. But if you want to become a patron of the Fellowship of the Road, if you want to join the Fellowship of the Road, do so by visiting patreon.com/TolkienRoad. YouTube, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe, and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. All right. So while most of us aren't attracted to Tolkien's legendarium because of encyclopedic accounts of the flora and fauna of a fictional ancient land, it is precisely such detail found throughout Tolkien's works that accounts for the verisimilitude of Middle-earth, the way it seems to be a real place. And in some instances, we may even find that these details provide hints and clues to great purpose and insight. For example, in Tolkien's mind, how would men relate to an island paradise if they suddenly found themselves in it? These are the sorts of questions to keep in mind as we explore the natural life of Númenor, an account of the flora and fauna of the Starland, the Land of Gift. The sources for this section are Unfinished Tales and The Nature of Middle-earth. Both of those two are pretty much the entirety of this section, arranged by Brian Sibley so as to be a little more readable for the purposes of the book The Fall of Númenor. And there's one brief passage from The Lord of the Rings that's referenced as well. We'll get to that. All right. So, what were the flora and fauna of Númenor like? So, the first section we deal with is really interesting to me, and it kind of sets the stage for how Tolkien maybe thought of this question with regard to Númenor. So, I'm going to go ahead and read that. It would appear that neither elves nor men had dwelt in this island before the coming of the Edain. Beasts and birds had no fear of men, and the relations of men and animals remained more friendly in Númenor than anywhere else in the world. It is said that even those that the Númenorians classed as predatory, by which they meant those that would at need raid their crops and tame cattle, remained on honorable terms with the newcomers, seeking their food so far as they could in the wild, and showing no hostility to men, save at times of declared war, when after due warning the husbandmen would, as a necessity, hunt the predatory birds and beasts to reduce their numbers within limits. All right, so this opening paragraph is really interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, what does this mean by at times of declared war? It's just I think he just means when maybe when the Númenorians felt it was like there was a problem getting out of hand, maybe with some of these creatures, and it was time to put some focused effort into taming them and kind of dialing back the numbers that exist. These kind of animal husbandry questions, if you will. But it's funny to me to hear him put that in terms of in times of war. I can't think of any other meaning he would have for that. Because Númenor, war never really came to the shores of Númenor. Like they would go and fight wars in other lands, but wars never really came. So I guess it's possible that maybe Sauron had, inspired some evil actions in some of the creatures of Middle-earth from afar. But it's just it's kind of I think what he meant is the first thing I said there. And he actually uses that terminology again a little bit later on in this section. But he also speaks of, just being on honorable terms. And I think, this is really maybe the key phrase, one of two key phrases to understand the relationship of the men of Númenor to the natural phenomena of their land, to the flora and fauna of their land. They had a good relationship with these creatures, right? There wasn't maybe the degree of alienation that sometimes, especially in the modern world, maybe we can feel towards the creatures that are around us, the kind of wild creatures that are around us, towards the we often think of, and Tolkien kind of had this in the back of his mind in a lot of his writing about exploitation of natural resources. There didn't seem to be anything like that going on, and there wasn't this big issue of the stronger predatory beasts attacking like the Númenorians, right? He mentions nowhere in here the idea of like an animal attacking a child or something like that, or a grown, certainly not a grown Númenorian. So I think that's what he means by honorable terms. There was this sense in which if the predatory beasts needed to it, if they did end up doing something like stealing crops or stealing like maybe some of the tame beasts, those kind of things, it was only out of sheer necessity, right? It was only out of sheer necessity, and they seem to have this kind of like ingrained respect for the Númenorians, and even we'll see something like friendship going on. We'll get to that. A couple of other things from this first section here of Men and Beasts. Language was always a very important part of what Tolkien was doing with the works of Middle-earth. In a way, the whole legendarium is kind of this lifelong exercise in building a legend to support his imaginary languages, and that's still true here as well. He thinks of almost everything in terms of languages. So I wanted to read this passage just a little later on here regarding the naming of these various creatures. Neither are the names which the Númenóreans gave to animals and plants always easy to equate with or relate to the names of those found in Middle-earth. Many, though given in apparently Quenya or Sindarin terms, are not found in the Elvish or human tongues of Middle-earth. This is partly due, no doubt, to the fact that the animals and plants of Númenor, though similar and related to those of the mainlands, were different in variety and seemed to require new names. So, in some cases, we don't have, we don't have like normal, common speech names for some of these creatures. And again, remember from the last section we looked at on the geography of Númenor, and just kind of this general idea, the way in which we receive this knowledge within terms of the legendarium is like 3,000 years after the end of Númenor, right? It's kind of like these are like records that and things that are known in Gondor at the end of the Third Age, early Fourth Age, right? That's how we recount this information. And so there's been a long period of time since anybody actually was in Númenor, actually saw Númenor. So, they're trying to piece things together in some cases from scanty records. But, it's interesting that some of these creatures, while, there's nothing like I think that would feel too crazy to us necessarily in terms of what these creatures were. There are some creatures where we have names for them, but there's no equivalent name in the common speech, right? So, for example, here we do talk about, he talks about actually dogs and cats. There were no dogs in Númenor, at least native dogs. There were native cats. We have names for those things, right? We know that they were, we're talking about dogs and cats as we would think of dogs and cats. But then he gets to this creature in the next section called the Lopoldi. The Lopoldi, we don't exactly know what they were, but our best guess is there's something like a rabbit, right? There's something like a rabbit. So, but we don't have a lot of descriptive information to distinguish from how they may be different from a rabbit. But what seems clear is that they're not necessarily just like rabbits as we would think of them. Okay, so just an interesting little note there on the languages and the limitations of the knowledge that are handed down in terms of Númenor. Again, this is the kind of thing that increases the verisimilitude of the Middle Earth legendarium, the seeming sensation that it's real when you read it, right? Because Tolkien, even in terms of the textual history, how we get to knowledge, epistemology, he's kind of true to the history of Númenor. There's no like third person objective ability to just know everything necessarily. Okay, so I mentioned the Lopoldi. He also says that foxes were pretty popular creatures, and they would be used and to train. They would be used to kind of control the population of the Lopoldi, right? These rabbit-like creatures that we don't know a whole lot about. And it's interesting to me that foxes were, because I think of foxes as normally not being something that human beings can necessarily train. Now, I'm sure there's exceptions to that, but I know it's not a common thing where I live or in the United States, as far as I know, to have a fox as a pet or to see it as any kind of tame creature. But and I've seen a few, in my neck of the woods. Had a few in my backyard in the last few years, and they're definitely afraid of humans. They definitely don't want to come near humans. If you've ever heard of a fox howling at night or doing its mating call at night, it sounds like you've got a ghost in your backyard. It sounds eerie as heck until you realize what it is. I actually caught a fox on video a couple of years ago, maybe just a year ago, in the early morning, like howling in my backyard, and just put the video up to it. And before I knew what it was, it sounded like, what is that thing? It's kind of scary sounding. All right. So foxes were used to hunt down the Lopoldi and to kind of keep control of the population there. But again, it's not like hunting them down to extinction. It's just controlling the population so that everyone can live in harmony, right? All of the creatures of Númenor, from men to the smallest, can kind of have this harmonious existence together, at least in natural terms. All right. Next up is bears. So, bears. Were there bears in Númenor? How did they relate to the men of Númenor? Bears are frightening creatures. Bears, for us, normally we think of them as like, ooh man, you don't want to cross a bear in the wild, right? Like, whenever I'm out hiking, that's something I'm kind of nervous about. You you've heard stories about like coming up on a bear, surprising it, and it is not pretty. Bears are going to win a lot of the times unless you're unless you're armed and prepared. So um, bears can be scary for us. But what's really interesting is that they had bears in Numenor, and apparently like pretty big bears, brown bears, black bears. Um, the bears seem to be pretty friendly with the Numenorians. Um, it says they never dwelt in or near the homes of men, but they would often visit them in the casual manner of one householder calling upon another. Like, I love that, right? Bears in the casual manner of one householder calling upon another. Like, it's like, the bear is your friend. It's like you got the Berenstain Bears living next door, right? It's like it's as if they're just these other, not human, but human-like creatures, that are just going to visit you. Now, I don't think Tolkien. I know Tolkien didn't mean by that necessarily like the Berenstain Bear kind of thing, this cartoonish kind of like bears as humans, but I think he meant to say that there was not nearly this degree of alienation that we have from bears, where they're these creatures to be feared for us. These were creatures that were not just going to up and attack people, right? They were, I mean, essentially on friendly terms with with the men of Numenor. So that's kind of cool. And I love this part about bears dancing. So let me read this. This is pretty funny to envision. Most strange of all were the bear dances. The bears, the black bears especially, had curious dances of their own, but these seemed to have become improved and elaborated by the instruction of men. At times, the bears would perform dances for the entertainment of their human friends. The most famous was the great bear dance, Rugzoale of Tompole in the Forostar, to which every year in the autumn many would come from all parts of the island, since it occurred not long after the Eru Huntale, at which a great concourse was assembled. To those not accustomed to the bears, the slow but dignified motions of the bears, sometimes as many as 50 or more together, appeared astonishing and comic. But it was understood by all admitted to the spectacle that there should be no open laughter. The laughter of men was a sound that the bears could not understand. It alarmed and angered them. I mean, there's just so much so much thought into that one little image, this one little glimpse of like the bears of Numenor. It just shows you this is why Tolkien was such a genius. He mentions that it was astonishing and comic, but it's not. He doesn't write about this in this kind of like weird sensationalist way, right? This way that you're like, okay, that's like. But it truly sounds like it could just be this natural phenomena of this particular land. If you've if you've ever seen some of these comic videos of and let me say this: when I think of bears dancing, I do think of like the kind of circus bear and the tutu and everything like that. And I guess bears maybe can be trained to dance, but this does not sound like training bears to dance. It sounds like something they did of their own. And it's interesting that it came in not long after the Eru Huntale, and I'm not sure which of the great prayers it was, but that was one of the three great prayers that happened on the Mental Tarma. We'll get to that in another episode. But it's interesting to think that like they did this at a time when the people were all assembled and could kind of bear witness to this, and it's almost like it's like, what was going on with that? What was the connection? Was there some kind of connection there, right? Was this some kind of like natural joy, like supernatural joy that was almost filling the bears, at this particular time, causing them to, to have this like dance, like this, joint dance going on of 50 or more together. Just don't laugh at them when they're doing it, even though it's comic, right? Even though it's comic, it will alarm and anger them. And I like that again too, because Tolkien seems to understand that, like, yes, nature can be funny, but treat nature with dignity, right? Like, treat it with the dignity that it deserves. And these are great, fearsome creatures, right? They can do some damage if they get angry and alarmed. Treat it with dignity, but it certainly would have been a sight to behold to see these bears dancing. And by the way, you can find videos of bears dancing in the wild. It's the one I found was like a nature show. I think it was like a National Geographic show on Disney, and it's like bears after they've been hibernating for a long time. They like find these trees and they start rubbing their backs up against them, and it looks really funny. Now in the video, of course, they put some like dance music to it, so it that makes it seem even more comical. But that's the closest thing to like natural bear dancing, I guess, in our terms, that I've been able to find. it would be, but this seems to be something almost like to another level that Tolkien is describing here. So anyway, bear dancing. Who knows? Maybe they'll depict it for us in the Rings of Power. Although I don't know that they necessarily have rights to the idea of bear dancing. Who knows? All right. Next up, woods, fields, coasts. Basically, Tolkien goes on to elaborate. There are many other types of animals. He mentions squirrels as being very abundant. There were lots of squirrels. And the squirrels, again, they would actually come into the homes of men. Let's see if I can find this line here. The women of Númenor were specially fond of them. Often they would live in trees near a homestead and would come when invited into the house. So it's almost like they had like kind of this. The squirrels too had this friendly relation with the men of Númenor, and especially with the women of Númenor. You think we saw with the bears, they seem to be kind of like one neighbor to another, right? This kind of like just showing up from time to time. And with the squirrels, it would seem the same thing, right? They would actually come into the homes. Now, I've got tons of squirrels in my backyard. I could never think of inviting any of the squirrels into my house. Of course, if I did, one of my two cats would probably quickly kill them and dispatch them, because the outside cat really loves squirrels. He kills a lot of squirrels. But the squirrels here, I would never think of inviting them into my house. They would never want to come into my house. But here, they actually want to come into the homes. So again, we have this sense of like friendliness, right? That the creatures aren't afraid. They aren't alienated from the men of Númenor. They don't just fear them, but there's this sense of like, wait, I can trust these larger, more intelligent creatures, right? There's nothing to fear between them. Interesting. It's like this just natural paradise. It's not it's not maybe Eden necessarily, but it's more of a paradise than any place I know of, right? In this world. He also mentions used a term I'd never heard before, kine, and that actually just means cattle, I guess. That's simply what it means. There's a lot of deer. He mentions another creature that we don't know exactly what it was, an Kelly, and he says it's kind of like a hedgehog. And lots of other creatures as well. He says there's lots of seals on the coast, especially northwest. I was hoping he would tell us more about if the seals were friendly, because I always think of seals as being very funny creatures. Like they're kind of a hoot. They're pretty entertaining creatures. Whenever I've seen videos or anything of them, maybe walruses too. Like they're always pretty entertaining. But he just kind of mentions that they're there. They exist on the coast, especially northwest, and other animals of uncertain kind. In all of this, I'm just going to pause here for a moment before I continue with this chapter. I get this sense of like this natural communion with the land. All right. Let me read this from On Fairy Stories. This is what he says in On Fairy Stories that relates to all this. Beasts and birds and other creatures often talk like men in real fairy stories. In some part, often small, this marvel derives from one of the primal desires that lie near the heart of fairy. The desire of men to hold communion with other living things. So, before I looked that quote up to prepare for this episode, I'd read it many times before, and I had kind of in this mind this idea of like talking with like animals. Like, for those of you who have pets, you ever like think to yourself, oh man, I wish I could really just talk to you, like like you would understand, and then I can understand what you say back to me. That would be kind of cool. Tolkien distinguishes in On Fairy Stories from what he calls the beast fable, which is the idea of like, it's like the Wind in the Willows kind of thing, where it's like the personified creatures of the meadows, right? Mr. Toad and all. Like, he's not talking about that. He's not talking about animals as stand-ins for human beings. He's talking about like actual animals and being able to hold some kind of communion with them. And that word communion is much more than simply communication, right? Communion is the sense of like one soul to another, right? It's the sense it involves communication of many times, but it goes way beyond that. I think sometimes we see that in Lord of the Rings and the relations of some of the characters to like horses and that sort of thing, right? The ability to just like kind of like the horse whisperer idea, right? Like, I can just speak to the horse and I know what he's saying even without using words like that I would understand in a normal sense. I kind of understand him. I get him, right? that kind of deep down soul to soul understanding between men and beasts. I think that's what Tolkien is getting at here, and I think he's getting at it on an even greater level. But it strikes me that what he's describing with Númenor is kind of an embodiment of that idea, right? The desire of men to hold communion with other living things. It's a beautiful notion. It's a really beautiful notion, one I really appreciate, and I see it illustrated here with Tolkien in the land of Númenor. All right, fish. There were plenty of fish to eat. Obviously, it's island kingdom, and there was abundant fish just all around the island. Another interesting thing is that there were really no sharks around the coast. They, when they went out to sea, obviously in their ships, they might encounter sharks out there. But apparently, it was a grace of the Valar. They say whether it be a grace of the Valar or some other natural cause, maybe it's both. Oftentimes, it works that way. There was no shark issue, right? They didn't have to fear shark attacks on the coasts of Númenor. So, bonus, right? All right, birds. Eagles, we'll talk about eagles more. They actually play a significant role in kind of some bigger issues with Númenor, as you would imagine with anything Middle-earth. But the eagles were all held sacred to Manwë, so there was certainly no battling with the eagles, at least early on in Middle-earth's history. Later on, when things start to go bad, there is some of that, but we'll get to that much later. Really interesting note about the seabirds and that they would like welcome the seafarers home or accompany them to Middle Earth, like all the way to Middle Earth. They would welcome them home. They would like come out to meet them when they saw them coming home. And Tolkien describes it as like in a gesture of like welcome and gladness. How cool is that? Again, like this idea of community, like the birds are happy to see the Númenorians coming home, right? Like, oh man, it really is. It's this little island paradise. And you might gloss over these things and say, oh, these aren't important. But it's these details that give us the picture of what Tolkien had in mind for Númenor, right? That things are just, they're a little bit different. They're a little bit happier. They're a little more joyful here than you would expect anywhere else. Okay, we're not talking about like all Disney light and sunshine, but we're talking about like in terms of kind of reality. Like, what if what if the birds like welcomed you home, right? Right? What if there was this just natural sense of communion and harmony between all living things in a particular place? How wonderful and how beautiful would that be? And it would be a true sign for people who had come from this land where maybe there was a lot more alienation going on. It would be a sign to them that they really were in this land of grace, this land of gift. There were many beautiful and small songbirds of great variety. And the caging of songbirds was thought an unkind deed. So rarely did they ever cage them, and whenever they did, it was because they needed to for some reason for the good of the songbird, and then it was just like they could still kind of come and go as they pleased, right? So there was really never like, we're keeping you in jail, songbird, right? The songbirds were rarely ever caged, and they were, even when they were, it was for their own good and for them to be kind of, and they were still kind of free to go. All right. Trees and plants, the flora. So not much is known about the native varieties. We do know that when the Númenorians arrived in Númenor at first, there was an abundance of timber. And I assume that was there for them to be able to, just to build things, right? To build dwellings, all those sorts of things. There was a particular type of tree called the Larinque, and it was so beautiful that there was a question of whether it was descended from another tree that goes way back in the legendarium. So let's look at this passage. In the Hierostar, they found also walnuts, in the Larinque, in which they delighted for its flowers, for it had no other use. This name they gave it, Golden Rain, because of its long-hanging clusters of yellow flowers. And some who had heard from the Eldar of Lorelin, the golden tree of Valinor, believed that it came from that great tree, being brought in seed thither by the Eldar, but it was not so. So apparently, it at least in the description and what they knew of Lorelin, one of the two trees of Valinor, it bore a resemblance to it, and they thought that it might be descended, but in truth, they did learn that it wasn't necessarily so. Even still, you kind of wonder, like, was it supposed to be sort of a tribute or a reminder of that particular tree? We do know that there is a not necessarily direct descendant from Telperion, the silver tree of the two trees of Valinor, but a closely sort of, we'll get to all of that, the white tree of Numenor and what that's all about. But we do know that that's a much closer sort of relationship there going on. And maybe we'll come back to Lorien Quay when we talk about that, just to, compare and contrast those two examples. As far as other trees from the west, from the Blessed Realm, we have these fragrant trees. Now, these are really interesting as you look over these. Again, you can easily gloss over some of these names and just think like they aren't that important, but when you pay attention, it's really neat. And in this case, because some of them seem to have a lot to do with the Valir, the goddesses of the Blessed Realm. So they were named the fragrant trees, just gave off beautiful fragrances. And you probably have an idea of how important fragrances are to how you might feel in a given situation, and just like, beautiful fragrances can help you feel at peace. So these trees from the west, what were they? There was the Oyolaire, which means ever summer, and these names are all from Quenya. Laire Lose, which means summer snow white. Nesamelda, the beloved of Nessa. Nessa was one of the Valir. Vardariana, which I believe means gift of Varda, and Varda was the High Queen of the Blessed Realm, the Lady of the Stars, and this is where her gift, apparently, right? That's what the name means. Taniquelase, which means high snow leaf, and Yavanna Mire, which means jewel of Yavanna, and Yavanna was, of course, the Valir who created all of the flora and fauna, kind of the lesser creatures of Middle Earth, right? She was the one that gave life to them. If you go back to read chapter 2 of the Silmarillion of Ale and Yavanna, you learn a little bit more of that. So, what's in a name, right? We learn about each of these things from looking at their names. They're not just random things that Tolkien made up, but they actually have significance within those languages. The Malinorne, all right? This is the golden tree, and this is actually a tree. The description is one big silver trunk, so like a silver pillar, and then golden leaves. And this is where the passage from the Lord of the Rings comes in, because this gets into Legolas's description of Lothlorien. Apparently, these trees were the same trees, or at least the predecessors of the trees that were in Lothlorien. All right, and gave Lothlorien the appearance that kind of took Legolas's breath away. I'm going to read this passage that'll give us a sense of how that worked. Its fruit was a nut with a silver shale, and some were given as gift by Tar Aldarion, the sixth king of Numenor, to King Gil-galad of Lindan. They did not take root in that land, but Gil-galad gave some to his kinswoman Galadriel, and under her power they grew and flourished in the guarded land of Lothlorien, beside the river Anduin, until the high elves at last left Middle-earth. But they did not reach the height or girth of the great groves of Numenor. All right, so that's how they eventually came to Lothlorien. I didn't look this up, but I do believe that it is the same. Is it the same? Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe it's the same seed that's given to Sam to plant when he gets back to the Shire. Could be wrong on that. All right. And lastly, we have of the beasts and birds of the Edain. We learned that the Edain brought many with them. So not a whole lot to say on that note, but the Edain did bring stuff with them when they arrived in Numenor, but there was already a lot there as well. So it's not exactly clear what was native and what wasn't, but we do know that there was both. There was stuff that wasn't native and stuff that was. All right, and then a couple illustrations in this particular section. The first one at the beginning of the section, we just have an image of what looks like bears, and it actually looks like one of these bears is rubbing its back against a tree, doing the dance I was describing earlier from the National Geographic video. And I was trying to look at these trees and see if I could pick them out. I'm just not very good at kind of discerning what tree is what. That's not really my forte. But cool image there by Alan Lee. And then we also have the image at the end of the chapter, which I wish was a little bit bigger, but it's a cool sketch. This would be the tower of the tower of the King's Palace in Armanelos, the eyrie where the golden eagles lived. So the Golden Eagles. And I didn't mention that, but the Golden Eagles lived in this eyrie. Some of them lived in this eyrie above the king's palace in the capital city of Armanelos. Again, so just to show the importance, the eagles, they were sacred to Manwë. They had a very important purpose in Númenor. They weren't like to be viewed as pets, but they were more like kind of watching over Númenor, and they were almost like the ambassadors from Manwë, right? Interesting to think about. All right. So, these details, while perhaps obscure in terms of the broader legendarium, form a picture of Númenor as a land that was indeed a land of gift. Whether it is the strangely warm relations with bears and squirrels, or the fragrant and majestic trees that were gifts of the blessed realm to the elf friends as they arrived in their new home, Númenor does indeed seem to be a land where men hold a sort of communion with the natural order, a communion that we rarely find in our present day. It further lends to the image of Númenor as an earthly and temporal paradise, if not quite an undying land. All right. Well, let's hit a quick note of correspondence. Got a really interesting one from Mary Rose on the Tolkien Road on TolkienRoad.com. This is in response to episode, I believe it's 141. Goes back a ways, which was an unexpected party, chapter 1 from The Hobbit. 144. It's in response to 144. Mary Rose says this: while listening to this, my first podcast of yours, referred by the One Ring guest appearance, again, shout out to theonering.com, I thought I'd start at what was the very beginning of the legendarium for me. It occurs to me that the dwarves did Bilbo a huge favor, planned, perhaps, by clearing almost all the food out of his house so that nothing badly spoiled when he was gone for a year. So though he had his brekkie, eggs were probably delivered fresh every day, he didn't leave a lot of food to go bad. Just a thought. I think it's a great thought, Mary Rose. And in fact, I love the way you're thinking of that. Like the dwarves, again, they seem like a nuisance and an interruption and a bother to Bilbo. But it turns out that in the grand scheme of things, whether they really intended to or not, they actually did him a lot of favors. And this may be just another one of those favors, right? Well, first of all, they took him out of his kind of comfortable existence, sent him off on this big journey, and they were actually doing a favor not just for him, but for all of Middle-earth eventually, without necessarily knowing it themselves. And I think the dwarves oftentimes, like their actions are probably more selfish, but they have kind of a serendipitous result to them, which is actually beneficial for many more than just them. And in this case, I also see it like he doesn't have to worry about the food spoiling, and he doesn't have any food left, so it's almost like one less thing to keep him behind, right? He's like, well, I don't have food to sit here and enjoy. I also don't have to worry about it spoiling, so maybe I'll just go off on this adventure. So I think it's a great thought. It's these sorts of details again that really make Tolkien such a great writer, such an enjoyable writer, and one you can just keep on coming back to time and time again. So thanks so much for your note, Mary Rose. Really appreciate it, and keep in touch on your journey. All right, keep the correspondence coming, everybody. We'll do our best to respond to you somehow and at some point. Hey, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. If you are a 5-star fan of the Tolkien Road, you can really help us out by heading over to iTunes or your preferred source for the show and dropping us a rating and review. When you do that, it helps get the word out about the Tolkien Road, which helps us to keep on evering on. And thank you to our amazing patrons, especially the following: John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Eru27, Emilio P., Jonathan D., Mike M., Robert H., Paul D., Julia, Werty, JoeBagelMan, Jacob S., Richard K., Matt R., Matthew W., Garret P., Chris K., John W., Eugene D., Chris B., Daniel S., Seb M., Shana Supreme, Cory C., Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T., Redhawk, Shannon S., Brian O., Zeke F., James L., Chris L., Chuck F., Asya V., Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C., David of Pints with Jack, Eric B., and Johanna T. Thank you all so much for your support. Really appreciate all of our fellowship, our entire fellowship, and thanks to everybody for listening. We will talk at you next time. Bye-bye.